And I'm so glad to be here this evening to hear my dear Father Joseph. I wish you all the best. Welcome. And now I will give Voja a moment to say more.
Thank you very much. Reverend Fathers, dear brothers and sisters in Christ, Happy New Year and a very warm welcome to all of you to our Conversations on Faith. This is the third one since we restarted our talk on the 20th of December last year. For those of you who are with us for the first time, the format of this talk is a prayer service followed by a talk by one of our priests or visiting speaker, and then some refreshments afterwards. There will be opportunity to ask our speakers tonight a few questions after his talk. Today we have great pleasure in welcoming Father Joseph to our church. He's well known to our clergy, as just heard, and laity alike, both as a serving priest and for his activity in the inter-Orthodox relations and the liturgical committees. At Pan-Orthodox Vespers on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, you will recognize him as the only one in the church with a cool head and able to keep track of what's going on both in the altar and in the choirs. Father Joseph was born in England of Irish mother and English father. He was baptized and raised Roman Catholic. He read natural sciences at Cambridge, specializing in biochemistry, and received his PhD in microbial biochemistry from University of Leicester. He did 3 years postdoctoral research in USA, which turned out to be a milestone in Father Joseph's life, as it was during this time that he was received into the Holy Orthodox Church. He returned to the UK in 1986 to work in pharmaceutical research. The same year, he began to attend services at the Ennismore Gardens Cathedral. He was ordained a deacon by Metropolitan Anthony in 1995, and he left his secular job in 1997 to serve in church, study theology and Russian language. He was ordained a priest in 2007. Currently, he serves at the Cathedral of the Domitian and All Saints and other 4 parishes. When I asked Father Joseph for the details of his biography, he sent me a short version and a long version. The short version is what you just heard, and the long version is a delightful interview which Father Joseph published in the diocesan magazine Suroj. This interview with Father Joseph shows both his lives, one of a scientist and the other of his journey into the Orthodox Church and priesthood, and they're both very fascinating, and for both of these roles he has given his 100% dedication and effort. If anyone is interested in this interview, I'm happy to pass it on to you. This interview gave me insight of his experience of working with Metropolitan Anthony Bloom of blessed memory and Bishop Anatoly, both of them well known for their life of prayer and spiritual life. The parish of the Cathedral in Ennismore Garden has experienced some significant change over the last 3 decades, including the high point of the reunion of the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate with the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, and the low point, thirdly, of the split and the departure of some of the flock and clergy under Bishop Bartolome of Sergiev. Father Joseph has first-hand experience of these events in his parish, and his role in the cathedral has evolved greatly between the time when he first entered it and today when he's an indispensable part of this thriving community. His last effort is the publishing of this prayer book for children. And one of the parishioners is an artist that painted the illustrations. So I can pass it around. If anyone is interested, again, just let us know. We can pass on the links where you can order the book, for the prayer book for children online. Father Joseph will tell us more tonight of his 2 lives, his evolution from scientist into an Orthodox priest. Father, you're very welcome to our church, and we sincerely hope that we will see you here again in the future. Thank you for coming.
I think I will, so that I can be heard at the back and used to be on my feet. Thank you, dear Father Milon, for your warm welcome. Thank you, Václav, for your words. When Václav first asked me to give this talk, my immediate reaction was, not why me? Because there are people who are much better qualified to talk to you about science or religion, both because better scientists and better theologians. It's true, I have a scientific education. I worked in medical, early stage medical research, cancer research for a decade. But in the global scheme of things, I'm a very minor scientist, and likewise, my theological education is fairly minimal. I've learned things as I've gone along, for better or for worse. But then I remembered a story by Metropolitan Anthony, a sort of teaching, who said that it was about obedience. And he says, to be obedient, you must be like a sheepdog. You know? When the shepherd says, go round up those sheep, the sheepdog doesn't answer back and says, well, you know, I'm not a very good sheepdog. This other sheepdog over here will do a much better job. You know, it just goes for it. So, in obedience, I offer you a few scattered thoughts on the questions of science and faith and their relationship. I don't like to lecture for a long time. I will just introduce the subject, but I'm very happy to have a conversation with you on these matters. The title I gave is Faith in Science, which has a certain intentional ambiguity, which we'll explore, or how a biochemist evolved into an Orthodox priest. So there could be a little bit of autobiography in the talk to make it a bit more personal. But let's start with some definitions. Science and faith, what do we mean? As always, the Greek is instructive. The word for faith in Greek is piste, and the word for science is episteme. Episteme, thank you. From the words themselves, even if you don't know much Greek like me, you can see that these are closely related concepts. Faith, piste, is what you basically you have trust in. If I say I have faith in you, it doesn't mean that I'm reasonably convinced that you exist. It means that I trust you, that I can, in a way that goes beyond rational demonstration. Science is that which can be known, discovered and known by rational investigation. It is an attempt to understand reality by the construction of theories. Theories about the world, which have to have two essential characteristics. First of all, they have to be constructed on the basis of experimental observation, reproducible experimental observation. And secondly, they have to be what's called falsifiable. That is to say, in principle, capable of being disproved by an incompatible experimental observation. So the concept of evidence is very important in science. Faith, on the other hand, to take the definition of the apostle in Hebrews, it is the substance or the assurance or the certainty of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. So again, we have the notion of evidence, but of things which are not subject to that kind of analytical, experimental investigation. So they are, if you like, two ways of apprehending reality. And the question is, are they in essential conflict, or can they be reconciled? Are they really complementary? So this is the subject that we are going to talk about. It's important to note that science, the whole scientific enterprise, is in a sense the product of, or daughter of, the Judeo-Christian theological tradition. Why? Because this faith, this is one that takes the world seriously, because it is God's creation. And because it teaches that the God's creation is good, that it is intelligible, because it is the work of the Logos of God. That's not the case in all worldviews, by a long way. For example, even around the time the emergence of Christianity, there was philosophies, religious groups who had a very different view of the world. Either that it was something illusory, or that it was something intrinsically evil. This would be Manichaean heresy. In some respect, this derives from elements of Greek philosophy, which assign all ultimate significance to intangible realities, be they the Platonic forms or other forms of Gnosticism, in which the material world is not significant, or may even be a hindrance to the spiritual life. But in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have something very different. That the world is good because it is God's creation, that it is intelligible because it's the product of the Logos of God, and that therefore it can be known, can be subject to empirical investigation. However, the developments in
It's 2000.
Christian theology and Western philosophy have led to a situation where, at least in the minds of many people and in the sort of popular consciousness, we have science here and what is generally called religion, or we would prefer to say faith, here, that they are essentially incompatible, and that science, in this struggle, science is the one that has come out on top in modern times. What has happened concerns is a result of the question of the theological exploration of the relationship between faith and reason. Here I'm indebted to a useful talk by Father Gregory Hallam, who's done a lot of significant work in this area. But it's a summary. In the Western scholastic tradition, they came to the position that certain religious theological truths could be arrived at by a process of reason. So, for example, you could look at the world and say it's obvious that there has to be a creator, there has to be a first cause, and things like that. So the Western theology made room for reason. In a sense, it gave it a certain space, conceptual space in which to work. Although, rather quickly, that led to a conflict. For example, think of the conflict between the Catholic Church and Galileo on the question of the sun going around the earth or the other way round. Because on a more or less literal reading of scripture, we have a conflict, contradiction of astronomical observations. A little further down the road, by the time we get to the 18th century, after the Protestant Reformation, we see a further distancing between faith and reason. The faith retreats into a kind of pietism, detached from the rational discourse, non-overlapping, non-intersecting. And in the realm of philosophy, of the Enlightenment, which proclaims, which more or less deifies reason, and ultimately puts man, the rational human being, in the place of God. Where those Enlightenment philosophers who retain some kind of religious conscience tended to put it that way, that the universe has a designer, a creator, who does all that, pushes the start button, and then lets everything develop according to its own intrinsic natural laws, and then goes off and does something else, detached from the creation. And so these parallel developments in philosophy, in theology, and popular piety have led us to the point where a priori it seems that science and faith are set up in a contradictory relationship. That, of course, has been amplified by the modern so-called new atheist of the Dawkins genre, who have proved quite adept at a certain kind of, if I say, propaganda, to the effect that no rational human being, who respects the scientific method, can possibly be a believer. So that's the big picture, the context. Let me come then to a little personal element. I've lost count of the number of times when people who meet me, dressed like this, find out that I have a scientific background. So, oh, that's interesting. And then the next question, well, how did you get from there to here? Well, as I've said in my short biography, I was raised in the faith, in the Roman Catholic faith, quite seriously. My mother was a real believer. I went to best Catholic schools and so on. And then, like most teenagers today, around the age of 15, I thought, no, I don't think so. I entered a kind of, I wouldn't say I was an atheist, but I was an agnostic, because that doesn't commit you either way. I think this was not so much an intellectual progress as a moral regress, because it seemed to me that the moral demands of Christianity were altogether unreasonable and unachievable by me. So for a few years I was in this state. I wouldn't say abandoned the spiritual dimension, apply. But I just found it in other places. And the time came, and I was 18 or 19, went up to the university just to read natural sciences, Cambridge. I had been interested in science from a very early age, from time when I would get the chemistry set for Christmas. I would turn the bathroom into a little laboratory, much to my mother's distress. But Dad was a farmer, so I learned quite early on to with my air rifle to shoot rats and birds and cut them up on the kitchen table. Well, anyway, so this youthful interest in science led me to the university. And before, I remember very clearly that the year before I was going up in my gap year, I confidently expected, I think, that the people, the interesting people I would meet at the university, would be similarly sort of free thinkers, shall we say. So you can imagine my surprise when it turned out that the particular group of around 10 of us in my college, who was the first year natural sciences students, turned out that 8 of them, 8 out of 10, were believers, were Christians. Imagine my surprise. Well, matters came to a head about halfway through the first term when I'd become, shall we say, friendly with one of these, this group, a young lady, and at a certain point I popped the question. I said, do you think, and then it was kind of abstract, do you think you could ever marry somebody who wasn't a Christian? She said, oh, I haven't thought about that before. Then after a short pause, well, actually, no, I don't think I could. I said, oh. Well, I went away and reconsidered my reconsideration, read the gospel, it's always a good idea.
Amen.
And about a week later, I went to the Roman Catholic priest and made my confession and came back into the fold. Some of you may have guessed that the young lady in question is now my Matashka, Sarah. And of that group, a couple went on to be really first-class scientists. One of them is now emeritus professor of neurochemistry at the Barts Hospital. Another one, Sally, is a fellow of the Royal Society and a professor of theoretical computational chemistry at UCL. So, you know, these were real scientists, but I was privileged to be in their company and to continue to know them. Both active in their respective churches, I might say. So this little autobiographical anecdote is just to show that empirically we cannot say that scientists are not believers. Many scientists. There were, by the way, there were agnostics and atheists other than myself in the college, but they were the people who were studying, you know, English and history and things like that.
Yeah.
They were the ones who subconsciously assumed that science had dealt with all that religion nonsense, not the real scientists. Of course, that doesn't prove anything in and of itself. It may just mean that these believing scientists are intellectually lazy and manage to hold beliefs that are mutually contradictory. A bit like the Queen in Alice in in Wonderland. Alice says, "But I can't believe you can't believe that. It's impossible." And the Queen says, "Of course you can. Yeah, when I was young, I used to spend an hour a day believing impossible things. I once believed 6 impossible things before breakfast." Human beings, we can be so mutually contradictory if we are careless about our thinking. But again, these are not simple, ignorant people by any means. So let's come back to the fundamental problems. It's usually presented in this way, that science is rational and faith is irrational. The scientific, and I would prefer to say this, not science, but scientism, the cult, philosophical cult of science, will accuse religious faith of believing things for which there is no empirical evidence, and holding to beliefs which are not falsifiable. Cannot be proved, cannot be disproved.